All right. So there's really, that question, what should be done here? There's kind of like two sides of this question, at least at this time period. There is the side that is advocated by the executive branch, by the president. At the time was Andrew Johnson, and that's not to be confused with Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was in president in the 1830s. Andrew Johnson is not related to Andrew Jackson at all, but sometimes people make that confusion. Andrew Johnson became president because Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. He was his vice president. Andrew Johnson, I just did it there. Andrew Johnson is a really interesting political character because he was actually, historians regard Andrew Johnson as maybe the most racist president in U.S. history. He was Lincoln's vice president, but the reason he was Lincoln's vice president was not because Lincoln and Andrew Johnson saw eye to eye on everything. A lot of people don't realize that in 1864, when Abraham Lincoln ran for the presidency, that it was a hard-fought presidency or election. That in fact there were members of the Democratic Party in the North, for example, as well as other groups that ran against Lincoln, and that his success in that election was not guaranteed by any means. And so, in politics, the reason you choose a vice presidential candidate is to try to appeal to a voting element that you might not be able to appeal to as well yourself, okay, to garner those votes. So President Andrew Johnson was brought in because Andrew Johnson was a Democrat from Tennessee. And you're probably thinking to yourself, wait a second, Tennessee, they seceded. And that's true. He was the only member of the federal government who had not seceded with his state. Now, the reason Andrew Johnson chose not to secede with his state was not because he was a noble thinking person when it came to issues of race and equality in the United States. The reason is because he came from an area of Tennessee. It's kind of the Appalachian mountain areas of Tennessee, the Smoky Mountain region of Tennessee. And he kind of grew up as a small, pretty poor individual, small farming, pretty poor individual. He had almost no education to speak of. And that group of the United States, the individuals living in what is now West Virginia and in the mountain areas of Tennessee, had a great deal of resentment for what they called the planter aristocracy, which was the 5% or so of the Southern sort of leadership in the South that had huge plantations and owned, hundreds of slaves each. And so he hated the planter aristocracy, but not because he had any kind of high-thinking notions of racial equality, but rather because he saw them as like an elite sort of economic ruling force, and almost like a monarchy in the South. And he wanted them to be sort of destroyed, if you will. He wanted that aristocracy eliminated. And so he refused to secede because he saw the secession naturally as driven by the desires of the planter aristocracy to maintain their political control in the South. When Lincoln is assassinated, Andrew Johnson becomes president. And this was, of course, John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. is the infamous assassin of Abraham Lincoln in 1865. And this was one of the most devastating events that could have happened when it comes to the immediate course of Reconstruction. Because Andrew Johnson, as I mentioned, he's actually an intensely stubborn and a really vehement racist. And Andrew Johnson seeks to undertake Reconstruction. And his approach to Reconstruction was effectively to ignore any of the issues that would be associated with, say, promoting racial or legal equality. So he's basically going to ignore that the whole issue was the issue of slavery in the South, the issue of the rights that should be due those individuals as a result of the 13th Amendment and the Emancipation Proclamation. He's largely going to ignore what is the new promise for the United States, the promise that people should, have equal rights, equal representation, equal protection of the Constitution, equal economic opportunity and educational opportunity. And instead, he's going to ignore those sort of notions. And instead, he sees Reconstruction. His goal with Reconstruction is simply, effectively, let's bring these seceded states back in the Union. Let's make that as easy as it can possibly be, and let's just get back to the business of doing what the United States does. And so he pardoned all Confederate officers. And while the U.S. Congress was on recess, he allows the southern states, he calls on those southern states to then vote with, again, all of your former Confederate leadership in place, and to vote to vote for their representatives and their senators to be sent to the Capitol in Washington, D.C. And that occurs while Congress is in recess, and the former seceded states all get together, effectively politically, like nothing's happened. Of course, we know the economy's destroyed and everything, but as though it's like they're just going to go back to business as usual in the Capitol. And what happens is those former states, not surprisingly, because of course the freedmen populations are not giving any right, they're not being given any right to vote right now. They're still completely disenfranchised. So they vote for effectively the old status quo. And when Congress returns to session at the end of 1865, Johnson has declared Reconstruction completed, and these new delegations of former Confederate politicians come to Washington. Let's get back to work. And among them, by the way, was even the former vice president of the Confederacy. So the second in command of Jefferson Davis, who had rebelled against the country, is now going to be brought into the Capitol building to go back to business as usual. Andrew Johnson says Reconstruction is completed. So that was like path one. Path one was, and Abraham Lincoln had pursued more of or before he died, of course, his ideas was that Reconstruction, they would try to reunify the country as swiftly and easily as would be possible. But a big difference between Andrew Johnson and Abraham Lincoln was that Abraham Lincoln was a very savvy politician. And he would have known how to work with the other side to create a legitimate compromise. Andrew Johnson, on the other hand, is an incredibly stubborn politician who wants to do it his way and really never compromises with anyone when his way does not sort of work. And so Johnson declares Reconstruction completed. And to his, I imagine his surprise, he gets a completely different reaction from the U.S. Congress and Senate. So here you see Charles Sumner. Charles Sumner was senator from Massachusetts, and Thaddeus Stevens. Thaddeus Stevens right here, who was a Speaker of the House of Representatives. And Thaddeus Stevens was an incredibly interesting individual. If you were ever to look up a character that you wanted to write a short paper on or something like that, Thaddeus Stevens would be a really, really interesting choice. Andrew Johnson had put forth this Reconstruction policy, which was basically like, let's forget any idealism. Let's forget the issue of racial inequality. Let's forget these types of things. Let's go back to business as usual and basically pretend none of this happened. The Republicans in Congress react to this with like real anger, and they will fight Andrew Johnson on Reconstruction. And effectively, the Republicans in Congress, and some of these, like Thaddeus Stevens, were deemed by their opponents the radical Republicans. They said, look, Reconstruction has to be a stringent form of Reconstruction. You can't just allow the former Confederacy, many of them former members of the Confederacy, to come back and rejoin the government without pursuing any of the larger principles that the Civil War became about. And so some of the radical Republicans, like Charles Sumner, like Thaddeus Stevens, they really want to change the South. They want to say, look, you cannot have your political structures based on sort of white supremacy anymore. You cannot go back to the status quo. There has to be a fundamental change here. And so Republicans in Congress will basically they will fight with Andrew Johnson. And Andrew Johnson, they override Andrew Johnson's veto a number of times. I believe it set a record for the number of times Congress has overridden the president's veto. And they will fight with Andrew Johnson. And Congress really has greater power right now than the president. The president doesn't have a lot of allies in Congress. And of course, the members of the Southern delegations, they don't have a voice yet. You might ask yourself, why doesn't Andrew Johnson have all those allies from the former slave states in the Confederacy? They just came back to Washington. They're part of the U.S. Senate and Congress, and that's where the mistake would be made. Because actually, in order to be a member of the U.S. Congress, what makes you a member of the Congress is not simply that you won an election. Theoretically, you have to have when you go to the first session, they call a roll. And if they refuse to call your name on the roll and refuse to seat you, then theoretically you're not a member of Congress. And so the Republicans in Congress were so angry about this process that these former, members of the Confederate military and the Confederate government were just being allowed to walk right back in as though nothing had happened. They rebelled against this, and they refused to read the names on the roll of those delegations from those former Confederate states. They refused to seat them. And when they refused to seat them, effectively, they had continued the process of disbarring those seceded states from participation in the government. And their idea was, you're going to be disbarred until there is a process of Reconstruction that is more thorough and based more on the principles of greater equality, of political participation, and so forth in the South than had been before. It was said that when that was going on, that one of the members of the Southern delegation stood up and said something to the effect of, "This is revolution." And, in a way it was, because this was a choice where in the Reconstruction period, the U.S. Congress was saying, look, we are going to move forward, but we're not going to move forward as though these events didn't happen. Instead, they're going to move forward, and they're going to create a path for the United States that will be based more on principles of equality and democratic participation, of equality and justice, and so forth. And so they refused to seat those members of the delegation, and this is where the fight ensues. And it is that act that allows the Republicans in Congress to then seize control of the Reconstruction process and to pursue the development of a more fair democracy, or at least the idea of it. It takes a long, long time for anything that looks like that to really take hold in the United States, as I'm sure many of you know. But they will pursue a Reconstruction that is more in tune with the ideas of the Emancipation Proclamation, the end of slavery, and creating the path for civil rights and greater equality, as opposed to going back to the ethnic nationalism of the pre-Civil War period. And so to do this, Congress, because now you have a situation where there's largely chaos in the South after this. And by 1867, Congress will dictate military reconstruction. And this is a look at the military reconstruction districts. And here you see the bottom date that you see in here are the dates that the state was brought back into the Union. And these states all had military delegations there, federal Union delegations there, and the states had to fulfill certain principles before they could be allowed to return back to the nation.